Hi everyone, Luke here from Weekend Tour Pros, and we're back again in the TrackMan studio at City Golf in Chichester to film another ball review. This time we're reviewing these. It's the Wilson Triad golf ball. Now Wilson don't get too much play on tour with their golf ball, and as a result they might not be top of your list if you're thinking about a new golf ball to try. But I've heard some really good things about the Triad golf ball, and I'm really keen to put it to the test side by side against the #1 ball in golf, the Titleist Pro V1, to see just how it stacks up. Now is this a really good mid-price point golf ball? Let's find out. Okay, before we start the test, just want to tell you a little bit of information about the Wilson Triad golf ball. First of all, the price point. In the UK, this golf ball retails at £34.99 for a dozen. That puts it in a really similar price point to the Tour Response and a little bit cheaper than the Titleist Tour Speed, which is a very comparable golf ball in terms of its marketing. In terms of its construction, it is a 3-piece urethane cover golf ball, exactly the same as the Titleist Pro V1 that we'll be testing it against today. And in terms of its feel, in terms of its compression, it's 80 rated in terms of compression, and that makes it very similar to the Titleist Tour Speed, and that is a little bit firmer than most other golf balls that it's competing against at this price point that are a little bit softer and a little bit less firm than something like the Pro V1 and other premium golf balls that are a little bit firmer. In terms of the colour options, it comes in 3 colours: the white that I'm testing today, the yellow golf ball that so many of you guys seem to like down the lens, and it also comes in a raw option, which is more like a matted finish golf ball. If you've seen the matte finish Volvic golf balls, it's very similar like that. I don't know why you'd necessarily play that, but if you like to play something a little bit different, maybe give that one a test. In terms of its performance characteristics, Wilson tell us all the things that we want to hear from a golf ball. They tell us it's their longest in terms of distance, they tell us it's going to offer a mid-feel, they tell us it's going to offer mid-height trajectory and high short game spin. So we'll look out for all of those claims when we're comparing it to the Titleist Pro V1, and let's get the test set up and get stuck into it. Now if you've watched my videos before, we're going to complete this test exactly the same as all of my other tests. We'll start with a 20-yard pitch shot with a 60-degree wedge. We'll then move up to full shots with a pitching wedge, 7-iron, and then a driver. And after each batch of shots, we'll go through the numbers from the TrackMan and see how the two balls perform side by side. And we'll always wrap it up with my concluding thoughts at the end and whether I could game this golf ball. Let's get stuck in. That is a lot more clippier, much more similar to a Pro V1. Okay, so just done hitting the 20-yard pitch shot with the Wilson Triad compared to the Titleist Pro V1. First impressions are the sound of these two golf balls is very similar. The Titleist Pro V1 has got that kind of clippier sound that a lot of people are used to. The Wilson sounded really similar to me in the bay. Actually, I couldn't distinguish between the two balls, and they also felt really similar as well. And again, the compression rating these two balls is quite similar, so maybe that's the reason why. In terms of the numbers that I saw, the Wilson seemed to be keeping up really well with the Pro V1 based on my quick glance of the numbers as I was going through. Definitely got some really good spin numbers from the Wilson, and it did seem to go out on quite a consistent ball flight time after time, which is exactly what we want from a golf ball on this type of shot. So let's go home, look at the numbers side by side against that Pro V1 just to see how good it really performed. Right, before we deep dive into these Wilson Triad numbers, this is exactly why I love doing these tests, because what you're about to see is the Wilson Triad is virtually identical to the Titleist Pro V1 on a 20-yard pitch shot using a 60-degree wedge in my hands. The club head speed identical at 35 mile an hour. The ball speeds identical at 32.4 mile an hour. The smash factors as a result identical at 0.93. Moving across to that spin, 4991 with the Wilson versus 5078 with the Pro V1. They're virtually identical, less than 100 revs difference in spin across a big batch of shots using a 60-degree wedge. Maybe the one thing you could call out as a little black mark against the Wilson Triad, if we're going to be really picky, is that spin consistency on this shot. 631 revs of standard deviation versus 441 with the Pro V1. But I really think I'm nitpicking here because I think that's probably my strike as a handicap golfer that's driving that. Carry number, almost identical, 0.1 of a yard in it. The launch angle, 0.3 of a degree in it. The peak height, identical. And the land angle, again, 0.3 of a degree in it. These golf balls are performing absolutely identical in my hands on a 20-yard pitch shot. What a fantastic start for the Wilson Triad golf ball. Let's see if that continues as we move into the pitching wedge. Okay, so done hitting the pitching wedges with the Wilson Triad compared to the Titleist Pro V1. And just like with that 60-degree wedge shot, I'm really struggling to notice a difference in the bay. They definitely felt they were both carrying on a similar number, definitely felt that the ball speeds were similar, potentially maybe a mile an hour or two slower with the Wilson, but the carry numbers were similar. I also seem to be noticing some really good spins with the Wilson, and I think it was launching and landing in a really similar window to the Pro V1 as well. So really keen to get home and look at the numbers side by side to see if that performance is just as good as it felt in the bay. Okay, so let's take a deep dive into those pitching wedge numbers. The first thing I want to call out here is that my club head speed with the Wilson Triad was 1 mile an hour slower than it was when I was hitting the Pro V1, but you can see as a result the ball speed was a little bit down. But the important thing to note is the smash factor with both these balls was the same. So what that says to me is that both of these balls are just as fast as the other one in this part of the test. Now, one thing I would say is when we look across the rest of the numbers here, just bear that in mind, because it might be that some of the shortcomings that we see in the Wilson are because I was hitting it a little bit slower. In terms of the spin rate, 7270 versus 7638 with the Pro V1. So the Pro V1 did spin a little bit more, but again, I think they'd be a little bit closer if the speeds were the same. And the carry distance was down by 2.7 yards, 113.9 versus 116.6. In terms of the flight and the launch windows, we can see that the Wilson Triad did pop up a little bit more off the face at 25.1 degrees versus that more toward preferred launch of 23.7 with the Pro V1. I'm not going to tell you which one of those is right and which one is wrong. I certainly like to see my golf ball pop up a little bit off the face because I'm someone who struggles to get the ball in the air, but there'll be other golfers out there watching this who prefer the ball to come in a little bit lower, particularly with a wedge. In terms of peak heights, not much in it, but a couple of feet of additional peak height with the Wilson and a slightly steeper descent angle at 46.7 versus 45.9. My overriding conclusion, much like that partial wedge shot you just saw me hit, is that these numbers are really, really similar and the Wilson is keeping up with the Pro V1, which is doing an absolutely fantastic job. Let's see if that continues as we move into the 7-iron. Okay, so done hitting the 7-irons with the Wilson Triad compared to the Titleist Pro V1, and my initial feelings while I'm in the bay is this is the first time I've potentially seen a little bit of a difference between these two balls. It felt like this Wilson was slightly slower on ball speed in the bay. Now again, we need to go home and look at the real data, but it really felt like I was having to really go after it to try and get ball speed numbers that were comparable to the Pro V1. And as a result, I think it's a couple of yards shorter than the Pro V1, but otherwise I was noticing very similar things again. So really keen to get home and look at the data a little bit more detail side by side. Right, these numbers are interesting when we take a look at them. It's the first time we can maybe see one little kind of negative to the Wilson Triad golf ball that maybe isn't nitpicking as much as I was with the 60-degree wedge. The club head speed this time was a fraction faster with the Wilson Triad, but once again that ball speed was lower than the Pro V1, 107.3 versus 108.5, and as a result you can see that the smash factor of 1.39 means it is a slower golf ball than the 1.42 with the Pro V1. Interestingly, the spin rate though is consistently 100 revs lower than the Pro V1. We've seen that in the pitching wedge, we've seen it in the 60-degree wedge, we're seeing it again now in the 7-iron, 4632 versus 4746. Also, the consistency of that spin rate really comparable to the Pro V1, which just shows how consistent this golf ball is performing. In terms of carry distance, the Wilson is 1.1 yards shorter than the Pro V1 at this part of the test, and we can see that the launch windows are very, very similar to what we saw with the pitching wedge. That Wilson Triad does want to pop up high off the face at 18.8 degrees of launch versus 17.4 with the Pro V1, and it does then get to a higher peak height of 77 feet versus 73, and that land angle is a fraction steeper at 43.4 versus 42.1. So what I am seeing here is in the middle part of the bag, the pitching wedge numbers and the 7-iron numbers are really, really comparable. Just that one little niggly black flag against the Wilson is the fact that it is a little bit slower than the Pro V1 in terms of ball speed. Let's move on to the driver. Okay, so done hitting the drivers with the Wilson and the Pro V1, and I must admit that I'm absolutely shattered now. Been in here for 2 hours, it is really, really warm, sweat's absolutely pouring off me. In terms of how I felt in the bay, I definitely think the Wilson was longer. I definitely had my longest couple of carries with the Wilson, but I do think overall it was a very, very similar ball. And I think all the way through this test, my feeling in the bay is both of these balls feel very, very similar, and the performance is very, very similar. So we really need to get home and dive into those numbers in a little bit more detail. So the headline from these driver numbers is that both of these balls are very, very similar. I'm pleased to say that the ball speed issue we saw with the 7-iron is not repeated in the driver as well. So let's take a look at those numbers and deep dive into them. The club head speed was a fraction slower with the Wilson Triad, not a lot in it, but it was a fraction slower, but the ball speeds were identical, 132.6 with both of these golf balls, and the smash factor was 0.01 higher at 1.43 with the Wilson Triad. We can say these golf balls are virtually identical at this part of the test, but again, if you do want to really say which one's the winner, we can say the Wilson is a fraction faster at this part of the test. We always talk about high launch, low spin with drivers. These balls are performing exactly the same. The launch angle 14.6 versus 14.5, and the spin rates of 2966 versus 2853, they're virtually identical. The one interesting little side note is the Wilson has been spinning a fraction lower than the Pro V1 throughout this test. With the driver it was a fraction higher, but we're talking about 100 revs of difference, exactly like we've seen in all other parts of the test, this time just in favour of the Wilson. In terms of the flight windows, we can see that the Wilson does go and continue its theme of kind of going a little bit higher in the air and having a slightly steeper descent angle. That's maybe not favourable with the driver, so that does mean that potentially the amount of rollout you'll get with this golf ball might be a fraction less. But again, I'm really splitting hairs and trying to pick the real minute differences between these two golf balls. If we look at how the carry numbers were performed, the Wilson Triad was 0.5 yards longer on average across these batches of shots, but the total distance was 0.8 yards longer with the Pro V1, potentially because of that slightly preferred ball flight with the driver. But again, if you put these two numbers side by side and ask me to pick out the difference, I wouldn't be able to tell you. The Wilson Triad is keeping up with the Pro V1 in the driver test, and it's performed really well throughout the test. So that brings me on to my concluding thoughts and answering the big question of would I game the Wilson Triad golf ball? The answer is 100% yes. To get Pro V1 type performance consistently through all 4 parts of the test at $34.99 a dozen versus that $47.99 of the Pro V1 is absolutely fantastic, and Wilson have done a bloody brilliant job here. Great job, Wilson. The only 2 potential black flags I could find against this golf ball, and I'm really nitpicking, is that the spin consistency with the short game shot was potentially a little bit too high compared to other golf balls that I've tested in a similar price point, and that ball speed with the 7-iron was a little bit of a drop off, and it was unusual because it wasn't something we saw in the other parts of the test, so it could just be that that was me as a mid-handicap golfer maybe not swinging it just as good with the Wilson. But overall the numbers are fantastic throughout the bag. They also do it in 3 colorway options, so I think there's something for everyone as well. I definitely think if you've never ever gamed a Wilson golf ball before, maybe you play a premium golf ball at the moment and they're just becoming a little bit too expensive for you, I think you should definitely give these a test. There's lots of my subscribers that have already told me this is a fantastic golf ball, so I definitely think we've got the user reviews on our side as well. All that remains for me to say is if you like my video, please do consider giving it a thumbs up. It really does help me, the channel, and other like-minded golfers to find my content on YouTube. And if you're not yet subscribed, please do consider hitting that subscribe button. I'd really love to grow the followers over the summer season and hit that magic 2,000 number before we get into the autumn. So if you're not yet subscribed, please do consider clicking that button and joining the Weekend Tour Pros movement, and you'll get notified when all my videos land. Thank you so much for watching my video. Have a great day. Keep on that quest to become a Weekend Tour Pro. Goodbye.